Okay, we're back. Anyway, I'm not touching the camera again, but right here is my friend from the Zusha band. Okay, so let's get straight into it. The title of today's class: Give Up the Fight and Enjoy the Light. As you know, for those of you who have been following the class here, what we'll do is we'll take a mimer, a Hasidic discourse of the Rebbe, blessed memory, and from it we'll extrapolate how to make it practical in a modern day issue. We start with the modern day issue, then we go to the mystical teachings, and we come back to the modern day issue. And hopefully by the time we come back to it, everything already is clear and makes sense. So, what is this modern day issue? Not sure if you people have heard it or not, watched it or not, read it or not, but you'll have links for everything in the notes that go out. For those of you online who want the notes, just send me, as always, your email address. I copy it into my list. You'll receive a copy of the links and the notes written out in longhand for this class. So you're going to see there are links over there to a movie called Peaceful Warrior. Peaceful Warrior is a movie that is based on a novel of the memoirs of a man called Dan Millman. He did fictionalize his memoirs, but it's based on his own personal true story. The book is called Way of the Peaceful Warrior, and why would he fictionalize it? So when I myself was taking online courses on writing, one of the teachers had us write why we're taking fiction writing, and my answer was because fiction is the best way to tell a true story, and that's exactly what Dan Millman does. So he does go through an accident, he changes his stuff, but basically what's happening here is that he was a gymnast and he had a motorcycle accident in which he broke the right femur, and how he overcomes it and the whole story. But the reason I quote this is because if you follow what the story is about, and in the very title, if you don't even know the story, the very word peaceful warrior is an oxymoron. Peaceful warrior. So even though many warriors fight and wage war in order to protect the peace and liberty of the people, but the bottom line is that they're warriors. So peaceful warrior is an oxymoron. Together with that, I will share with you that in recovery, you hear me speak about addiction recovery quite often, but in addiction recovery meetings, there is a chip system. And the way it works in the chip systems is they have different colored chips to denote your length of sobriety. The first chip you pick up is a white chip. You don't have any length. So the way they introduce the white chip is give up the fight and take the white. So here's an interesting notion once again. You have an addict who's been spending X amount of time in his life fighting addiction. There aren't very many addicts that enjoy being addicts and decide, oh wow, this is the way of life. Whatever they're addicted to, alcohol, drugs, sex, shopping, eating, the list goes on. Whatever they're addicted to, there was a time that it worked for them. They woke up in the morning, they had 2 drinks, they felt brave enough to face life. But then at some point, it turns against them. And when it turns against them, they try to stop. They try to fight their addiction. And then finally, when they're humbled to their knees and they come into the rooms, what's the first thing they're told? Give up the fight. Again, that same oxymoron. You're telling me that I'm fighting and fighting and fighting to overcome my addiction, and the one thing you tell me is, give up the fight. So we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about the oxymoron of how this all goes on. So, here's an interesting thing. Why would you be told to give up the fight when you're finally on your knees, willing to do whatever it takes? So I'm going to take you to a line in Tanya. The Alter Rebbe in Tanya, chapter 13, he quotes a piece of Talmud that's quoted twice, once in Tractate Sukkot and once in Tractate Kiddushin. And over there they talk about the power of the Yetzer Hara. And there is an amazing quote there in the Talmud. If not for the Holy One, blessed be He, the Almighty, helping him, he would never be able to overcome his Yetzer Hara. That's an interesting thing there. So as much as you're fighting, you have to fight, and that's what we're taught, right? You have to try harder, try harder, try harder. Where's your self-control? Where's your will? If you really wanted to learn, you'd stay up and you'd break your head through the Talmud. If you really wanted to be a mensch, you'd fight yourself. Everything is about fighting and fighting and fighting, and all of a sudden you're told that the whole thing helped to be toita bankis. That was an expression my grandparents would use. Bankis was leeches. They used to do bloodletting. A dead leech is not going to help anything. Toita bankis means dead bankis. Nothing's helping. It's not working. Why? The Gemara just told you why. If Hashem is not going to win the fight for you, you can't win. Which, by the way, in the whole, that's a whole different class. So what do you want from me then, Hashem? Why can't you just fight with this Satan and keep me out of this whole thing? What's the whole? A different question. But the bottom line is that's what the Gemara says. So now the question isn't how I can gain strength to overcome. How can I be the warrior who's going to, overcome my bad habits, my defects of character, my addiction, whatever it's going to be. How do I do that? The question isn't that, because I can't do it. The question is, how do I bring the HaKadosh Baruch Hu? How do I bring God? Who, if not for Him, I would never overcome. So how do I draw God into my life? And how do I draw the blessings of God into my life? The help of God in my life, in order to be able to win, to overcome. The question is answered in the closing statement of the entire Talmud. The entire Talmud, the whole Shas, ends with the Mishnah in Uksin. And the Mishnah in Uksin says, Le'motza Kadosh Baruch Hu Kli. God did not find a single vessel that could contain His blessing other than peace. So now we know. Now we're going to go back to why we say give up the fight and live in the light. Give up the fight and take a white, whichever one it is. Because if Hashem is not helping me, I don't stand a chance. And now I know the only way to invite God into my life, to have a vessel for God's blessing, God's help to be in my life, it's only peace. Now, truth be said, when I was younger, the definition of peace always meant not to fight with the other. It's simply what peace means. What does peace mean? It means stop fighting with other people. However, as I started learning Chassidus more and more, but not just Chassidus as this abstract, beautiful, esoteric, free ticket out of reality, but no, studying Chassidus and how Chassidus becomes a guide for a perplexed human who has two antithetical voices screeching in his head. When you study Chassidus that way, it becomes a real guide. And all of a sudden I found out through Chassidus that the Mishnah isn't talking about making peace with others. That's secondary. In the Rebbe Rashab, the fifth Luvabitcher Rebbe's book, Echolzu, the Rebbe Rashab, it was printed as a book. It's really just a series of Maimorim, but they made a kuntras, Echolzu, and over there he explains, for a person who has no peace with themselves, they are blocked off from even having the most natural genetic love which flows freely, i.e., from a person to their spouse and a person to their children. If you're not at peace with yourself, it is impossible to be at peace with anyone else. It just doesn't happen. Thus, now you understand that when the Mishnah says that God has no vessel in which He can fit His blessing other than peace, even if the primary focus here is peace with others, we now know that that is an outcome of whether you can have peace within yourself. Thus, the primary focus here is peace within. And with that being said, we're now going to go ahead and focus on the mimer of the Rebbe that was delivered in 1988. And the mimer is talking about, on the mystical level, on the impact of mitzvah performance, performing commandments. And from this we're going to learn exactly how it's possible to give up the fight and live in the light. That is the modern day issue. How do we stop fighting within ourselves? People are always frustrated. Really. Majority of our generation is either fighting or living in complacency. Either does not invite God and doesn't have the blessing of God. So how do we live in neither? I don't need to spend my life fighting. I don't need to fight with myself or others. This whole notion of no pain, no gain doesn't really need to exist. Okay? That's what we're going to learn from this mimer. So now let's jump into why this mimer is even talking about this issue. This mimer was delivered on this Shabbat in 1988. What does our Parsha have to do with anything? We're not even talking about mitzvahs yet. The first mitzvah that we speak about is in Parshas Bo. When God tells the Jewish people before they leave Egypt, they should know about the mitzvah of the new moon, Rosh Chodesh. We're not there yet. We're still 2 portions away from there. So the answer is that the Haftorah of this week is chosen from the book of Isaiah, chapter 27 into chapter 28. The first verse over there begins with Haboim Yashresh Yaakov. Let me read you the verse in English. Those who came, who Jacob caused to take root. Israel flourished and blossomed, and they filled the face of the world with fruitage. Obviously, he's speaking metaphorical, and we need to know what he's really saying. So, what does it mean, Yashrish Yaakov? Yashrish means take root. Yaakov means Jacob. What does that mean? So we have primarily in this teaching, in this mimer, he quotes from the third Luvabitcher Rebbe, who also quotes from his grandfather, the Baal HaTanya, and he talks about 2 different interpretations. One of them is the famous translation of the entire Torah, known as Targum Yonasan ben Uziel. Yonasan ben Uziel, the very famous sage, what he's most famous for is that the Talmud tells us that if someone flew over his head if a bird flew over his head while he was learning, from the heat and the spirituality, the bird would actually burn up. That's one of the statements. When I was in yeshiva, they used to joke around. They said the Chassidish yeshiva learns this. Wow, he was so holy. And the non-Chassidish yeshiva, when they learned it, they wanted to know, did he have to pay for the bird? But either way, let's go further. He says like this. He says that the interpretation of the words, those who came, who Jacob caused to take root, means they will, and I'm quoting for you, he actually talks in Aramaic, they will gather from their exile and return to their land, there will be born for the house of Jacob. Now, what does this mean? Born. Born means revelation. In the world of Kabbalah, everything exists within its source. You have what we call the Ilah and the Alul. So you have the mother, and in her womb is the offspring. And then when the child is born, there's the revelation, right? So what is he saying? He's saying that what Isaiah is talking about is the Messianic era. When the time comes that everyone will be gathered in from their exiles, and they will be brought to the land of Israel, their land. At that time and in that era, there will be the total birth of the soul. The essence of the soul. The revelation will exist. Okay? That's how he learns it, and thus Yashrish Yaakov, take root. Jacob, take root is the source of the tree, the source of what will later bring fruitage, and thus we're talking about Yashrish Yaakov really means the revelation of the essence of the soul. That's what he says. Then there's another interpretation which the Alter Rebbe talks about in his book of discourses on Shemot, and it's called Torah Or, and over there he defines it a little differently. Yashrish Yaakov, he says, means that God rooted within the Jews his seed, so to speak. What is the seed of God? So we know that Mount Sinai was held over our head. We know that Mount Sinai was dressed with flowers. And what we're taught is, from the mystical point of view, from the Talmudic point of view, it was an ultimatum. But from the mystical point of view, mountain protruding is an overwhelming love, and therefore what really was taking place was God put a chuppah, a marriage canopy, over the heads of the Jewish people, and that was the moment where God wed us as his wife. Now, when God wed us, then there was a consummation. What's the consummation that takes place between God and the Jewish people? What it means is that God planted his seed within the Jewish people, the womb of his wife. What is the seed of God? His Torah and his commandments. That's the pshat there. And then, what's the purpose of planting seed within the womb? The purpose is the offspring. That's a lot of what this class is going to be about. What is the offspring of this Yashrish Yaakov? But what we do see right now is that Yashrish Yaakov, in the first opinion, was the revelation of the essence of the soul, which will take place in the Messianic era. While in the second interpretation, we're talking about Yashrish Yaakov means that God rooted within the Jewish people his commandments. Two different interpretations of what Yashrish Yaakov was. Let's just go one moment further. And we'll say that the connection between these two interpretations. And it's interesting, in most teachings you don't find this. But in the Rebbe Blessed Memory's teachings, I remember I used to stand it by Fabrengens, if there's more than one opinion and more than one interpretation on the same verse and the same word, even though they seem to be opposite opinions going in different directions, the Rebbe wanted to know that there was a connection. Because how can there be two interpretations on the very same word that don't have a connection? If Torah is emet, and the definition of emet is that it matches masim ekol tzadu pina, that's the definition of emet, that it fits from all sides and all corners, then we must say that all interpretations that happen to be on the same verse, even though they come from two different school of thoughts, they have to be connected. And thus the Rebbe tells us that the connection is very easy to see. What brings about the revelation of the essence of the soul in the Messianic era is our performing mitzvot in the time of exile. Thus the seeds of the fruit, the seeds brings the fruitage. So our working the seed, our duration of the pregnancy now, working the mitzvot, will bring about the revelation of the essence of the soul. Okay? But right now we're going to jump into the mystical concepts. The mystical concepts here is, number one, those who came, haboim. What does that mean according to the second interpretation? Who came where before God planted his Torah and mitzvahs within us? Number two, the offspring. Stage one, the revelation of the soul essence. We spoke about that briefly. Number three, the offspring. Stage two, the revelation of transformation of evil. And then the fourth and final concept we're going to talk about before we come back to the modern day issue is, what is the peaceful warrior? Okay? All right, so let's go right into it. Those who came according to the second opinion. So let's go over it again, right? The second interpretation, in which Yashrish Yaakov, rooted within Jacob, refers to God planting within us his seed so that it take root, which is his commandments in the Torah, the 613 commandments. Who came before that? Haboim. Who came where? So the Alter Rebbe says, and this is built on a statement in the Talmud, he explains that the reason why the Jewish people went into exile in Egypt, in other words, the word Habaim of the Haftorah, who came, is connected with the opening verse of our Torah portion. Eile Shemot, these are the names, Habaim, who came to Egypt. Thus, when it starts off, the verse starts off, those who came, it's talking about those who went into the exile of Egypt. Then it goes on to talk about the Mount Sinai revelation in which God rooted within us his seed, so to speak. Torah and mitzvot. What's the connection? So the Talmud tells us that Egypt, the exile of Egypt, the slavery of Egypt, served as a smelting pot. That's the way you refine precious metals. You cook it up and you cook it up until you get out everything foreign and everything coarse. So you end up with very fine precious metal. Another way that this is explained in the holy teachings is that we talk about before you can put seeds in the ground, you have to plow the field. The field is too hard. It needs to be broken. It needs to be softened so that it can be open to receive the seed, from which then it will bring about the growth of a tree and produce and fruits and so forth and so on. Thus the Haboim is telling us that before the Jewish person was able to receive the seed of God, His Torah and His commandments, he had to be refined. And what's the definition of refinement, you should know? In the world of Chabad Hasidus, it's really a binary code. What's the binary code? Right? The X and the zeros. In Chabad Hasidus, the binary code is Yesh and Ayin. Ego and humility. Identity of separation or transparency. Do you see yourself as a piece of God, here to be transparent and fulfill God's will? Or do you see yourself as a person who has 613 different sgulot for the things you want? You want to find a shidduch, do this mitzvah. You want to become rich, do that mitzvah. It's all a bunch of stuff where I'm pulling strings, so to speak, to get what I want. So that's the bottom line. In order for mitzvot to be able to truly be planted and rooted within us, we need to first break our ego, our arrogance. And that's what the slavery in Egypt did. After that, Alter Rebbe continues with one more line. And so too it is in this exile that we're in now, which is preparing us for the revelations of the teachings of the Torah, which Mashiach will bring to us. Interesting. So now we have Habaim placed in two different eras. Habaim, before the year 2448, when we received the Torah. So there was first those years, Redu, right? The 206 years. 200, Redu. 10, thank you. I'm sorry, 6 and 4. I knew I said something wrong. The 210 years that we were in Egypt, that was one Habaim, preparing us to receive the Torah, smelting pot, refinery, plowing the field. And then there's another Habaim, which the Alter Rebbe kind of just says, and you should know, so too it is concerning the exile we're in now. However, there's one big difference. The exile of Egypt was the plowing of the field and the refinery before the seed was placed within us. So it was a preparation, not part of the process, but a preparation before the process. Whatever we're going through now in exile, in our refinery, and are being plowed, is taking place after the seed was put in us. In other words, that was a preparation. This is part and parcel of the process of what happens when the mitzvah is within us. Now, I want to just share with you. I did tell you that the Alter Rebbe says that it's a preparation for the revelation of Mashiach's teachings in Torah. And it is true that our sages tell us that even Moses will sit as a student before Mashiach to learn, because Mashiach is going to be revealing the essence teachings of the Torah. That's what is said. However, the Torah was only given once and will never be given again. There isn't the new Torah that Mashiach is going to bring to us. All that Mashiach is going to bring to us is a much deeper revelation in the Torah that God already gave us 3,300 years ago. So even when the Alter Rebbe says that this exile is a preparation for what Mashiach is going to teach us, it's still talking about what the process that's happening to us once the Torah and its commandment, i.e. God's seed, was rooted within us. Okay? So now, we understand the word Habaim, what it means. One hand it means in Egypt before, and on another hand it means once we're in exile after Matan Torah, before Mashiach comes. Okay, so with that being said, let's move on. The next concept we have to talk about is the offspring, right? There's two different levels of offspring. But I want to first take this to the next dimension. Post Mount Sinai, for 3,300 and pika, we've been doing mitzvot. However, generally speaking, the Jews performing mitzvot breaks into two categories. There is the era, which is close to 1,300 years, which we were in freedom. There was the 368 years of Mishkan Shiloh. There was the 405 years, the 410 years of the two holy temples. In those times, we were doing mitzvahs in one form, which is very different to the almost 2,000 years that we've been doing mitzvahs since then. There's two different type of categories of mitzvot. There's the mitzvot we did in peace and liberty and light, and there's the mitzvahs we did under the worst oppression. Spanish Inquisition, talking about all the other sufferings, the Shoah, recent terrorism. Jewish people in Israel are living under oppression. Bottom line, we're scared. There's bombing, there's stuff going on. So there's Torah mitzvahs done in the freedom of the Holy Temple, and there's Torah mitzvahs done in the dark times of exile. Two categories in the last 3,300 and something years since we received the Torah. Okay? Now, what is the difference between these two categories? The difference will teach us the different type of offspring there is from God rooting his seed within the womb of his precious wife, the Jewish people. Torah and mitzvahs placed within the Jewish people. What is the difference? So number one, when we speak about offspring, we're speaking about revelation of God. Now, I want to share with you that Torah study is what? Torah study is the revelation of the wisdom of God. Araita mechachma nafkis. The Torah comes forth from God's wisdom, God's infinite wisdom. Now, we've done enough classes here that we know that wisdom is the first of the 10 emanations, which means, in other words, that when we talk about the revelation of the infinite wisdom of God, we're talking about the revelation of the infinite light as it already began the transformation of the order of evolution. The order of evolution in the holy books is called Seder Hishtalshalut. There is an evolution which takes us from the infinite to the finite. That's when you talk about the four main worlds. We spoke about it, Atzilut, Bri, Yitzir, Asiya. There's come forth, there's creation, there's formation, there's action. We talk about the different type of lights. We talk about the contractions. We talk about the concealments. All of that is the process in which we go from the infinite light becoming a life source to finite creatures. Wisdom is the top of that. Now, it is true that the Alter Rebbe twice in Tanya quotes his teacher, Rabbi Mezrich, which said because of wisdom's power of humility and transparency, it houses of the infinite light. That is true. However, being that wisdom is the first of the 10 emanations, everything that comes through wisdom has already been transformed. It already is part of the order of evolution. It's already part of the system of bringing finite from infinite. Thus, Torah study, the revelation it brings to us, because Torah study is something you learn, something you understand, something you question, your intellectual process. That's all part of the order of evolution. Mitzvahs, what is a commandment? A commandment is not the wisdom of God. A commandment is the will of God. This is what God wants you to do, and this is what God doesn't want you to do. So much so that we're taught the famous verse, and if you sin, what are you doing to me? And if you do righteousness, what are you giving me? It doesn't affect me. In other words, from God's perspective, and I say this all the time when I use this as an example, you really think that God has an infinity to gefilte fish and an animosity to lobster? and he wants us to share his taste buds. What is going on here? And especially this example which I use for you, by the way, many people try to give logical reasons to kosher. You are what you eat and all. It's all wonderful. But from the Torah standpoint, kosher belongs to the category of statutes, not judgments, which means they don't have a human reason for it. They don't have human logical reasons for it. Maimonides says that you should know, in his book Mishnah Torah, he says that even statutes, because mitzvahs were given letzadif esabrius, to make a mensch out of the wild human nature, pera adam yevaled, so therefore you should know that even the chukim try to extrapolate a reason that will make you to become a better mensch. But in itself, it's statutes. Thus, with the mitzvot is not based upon the wisdom of God as much as it's based upon the will of God. I want to take it one step further, and in the closing of the class you'll see the logic behind it. But you should know that mitzvot can be fulfilled spiritually and can be fulfilled physically. Thus we're taught that God himself does the commandments he told us to do. So much so that the Talmud asks, Tefillin the Mari Alma, Tefillin of the Master of the Universe, what's written in it? Arsa Shema Yisrael, what's written in his? Right? So there is spiritual dimensions. We know that Jacob, when he was doing his genetic engineering with those sticks for the sheep, with the spots and not the spots, in Kabbalah we're taught that he was drawing the same spiritual effect that putting on tefillin draws. But it was all done spiritually. And that's why after he finished with those sticks, unlike we have to put our tefillin in Shemus, he was able to roast a marshmallow with it. Because it was spiritual, not physical. Now, when you have a physical mitzvah, not only are you dealing with the trans order of evolution, because it's not wisdom, it's will. Even more than that, when you do a physical mitzvah, you're now dealing not only with the will of God, but the essence of God. And we'll talk about that later. Thus we're saying over here that mitzvahs bring about the revelation of the essence of God, the circular, the will, the infinite, not the linear, starting with wisdom. Thus we now understand what he's saying about the mitzvot. It brings about a revelation of the essence. Which essence? The essence of your soul, which is truly a piece of God. Now, we need to understand, there is a prerequisite to mitzvahs bringing about the revelation of the essence of your soul. And that prerequisite is, just like I started telling you before, it's about humility. Absolute humility. If I'm doing mitzvahs for ulterior motives, i.e., like I shared with you before, the book of remedies, can't pay your rent, study Mishnah, can't find a shidduch, start giving tzedakah, that's not without ulterior motives. Thus, when we talk about the neshama being the revelation of the essence, we're talking about only when you do mitzvot with absolute humility, with no sense of self. Just putting things in perspective. When Moses gave over the word of God, when the angels spoke in the name of God, they didn't say, God told me to tell you. They used the word, so have I said. Because when you have absolute transparency that God's speaking through you, you don't need to say, God told me to tell you. That's where we find that language by angels. Total selflessness. That's the way we need to do a mitzvah for it to have this revelation. And if not, it won't work. Now, it's impossible for the egocentric human creature to ever from his own reach absolute humility. Because humility is usually brought about by understanding. That means that your arrogant mind is going to bring you out of your arrogance. Not going to happen. When I am humble before God because my arrogant mind is comfortable with understanding that God is greater than me, that's not humility and that's not transparency. Thus, how can we ever have absolute humility? The answer is when there's absolute revelation of the presence of God. When I'm standing in the face of God, which completely shatters my arrogance of thinking that I got this all figured out, then we have humility. Now, where did that happen? So there's a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. It talks about the miracles that took place at the Holy Temple. So Chaim Yankel is on Temple Mount in Jerusalem, holding his hat because it shouldn't blow away, and he looks up. And right there in the open courtyard, there's an altar, and there's stuff burning and being roasted, and there's a pillar of smoke going up. And the pillar of smoke is not being blown by the wind in any direction. That is a tangible, physical revelation of God, which whether I figured it out or not, I'm like, whoa. Another example. On the holidays, Jews from all over the world had to come. And they all stood at different times in the courtyard. And in the courtyard, those of you who ever belong to a Hasidic dynasty will know that if you ever go to Rosh Hashanah to your Rebbe, you're not going to have a seat, and you're not going to have standing space. I will just share with you a personal experience I had. I was standing by the famous Farbrengen in 1980, Yud Shvat, the 40th year. That was the year that Rabbi Luvabitcher Rebbe came to the Rebbe. I remember exactly where I was standing, and I remember that when the Rebbe walked in, everyone was jumping up and down, singing. You know how you dance. And for some reason, the bleachers that I was on went that way, and in between the that way and the that way, there was an opening, and I jumped up so I could see the Rebbe. My feet did not touch the ground for the next half hour. Literally, I was like, I was a little kid, and That's the way it was in the Beis Hamikdash. On the holidays, what do you think it was? Excuse me, sir, you're sitting in my seat. Can you move over? That wasn't happening. So it says, Oindim Tzfufim. They were standing there the way I stood by that Farbrengen. There's my little feet dangling. That was what it was. And then the next thing you heard, when the Kohen Gadol pronounced Hashem's name and everyone had to bow, the Mishnah tells us something magical. Everyone was able to bow spaciously. These type of physical things which led you and forced you to understand that you're standing in face-to-face presence with God. This doesn't happen even in Universal Studios. Thus, that creates an absolute humility where you say, I give up. I give up. This is greater than me. I saw it with my own eyes. My feet couldn't touch the ground, and all of a sudden I'm bowing with room from all sides. And then right after I'm bowing, I'm back up again. I'm standing there holding onto my hat that shouldn't go flying, and the beam, there's smoke, it's just going straight up. These are physical things we saw. When you see such a physical thing, the ego cracks because it can't wrap its head around it. And that's the foundation of all ego. Thus I ask of you, when we talk about mitzvahs that's done in absolute humility, which is the only way to have the revelation of the essence of your soul that will come out from this in the Messianic era, which mitzvahs are we talking about? We're talking about the mitzvahs that were done for the close to 1,000, 1,300 years in peace, in revelation, face to face with God. The offspring of that is the absolute power of mitzvah to reveal openly the essence core of your soul, which is truly a piece of God, the essence of God. So now that we know there's the category of how we did mitzvahs in a face-to-face relationship with God, physically feeling and sensing the presence of God, which gave us absolute humility, and that led to the offspring of being able to now plant that when Mashiach comes, there's going to be the revelation of the essence of my soul. That's that offspring. Now let's move on to the next topic, 3 or 4. We're now talking about the offspring on a different level. You see, the ultimate power of a mitzvah is the mere fact that mitzvahs have to be done physically. Well, let me share this with you, okay? I told you we would get to it. All of spirituality comes from the infinite light. Diminished, stronger, concealed, contraction, revealed, expression, essence. It's all spiritual. But from the spiritual infinite light, you cannot bring about the physical realm of existence. Thus we're taught in Kabbalah that yesh ma'ayin, bringing a physical something, can only come from chek haboira. It can only come from the bosom of God, the essence of God, and not the revelation of God's light. Because light brings light. Spiritual brings spiritual. Where does the darkness and the physical come from? That can only come from the essence of God. So the power of a mitzvah in its ultimate level is that mitzvahs must be done physically. I want to get a little further here. What is the offspring? What is the offspring of doing mitzvahs under persecution? Now that we understand that we're talking about the transformation of the physical, let's talk about this for a moment. There is a verse in chapter 18 of Tehillim. Let me read it to you in English. If I can find it here. Whatever, I can't even find that verse right now. Where is it here? Anyway, the verse says clearly that the essence of God sits in darkness. Let's talk about this for a moment. What do we say in Tehillim and Hallel? Hashamayim shamayim lashem ve'oretz v'sam lebnei adam. Heavens are God and the earth is ours. Right? What are we saying here? That before we did mitzvahs, how did the world exist? The world exists that heaven and spirituality was God's domain. The physical was the domain of what? Of my pursuit of pleasure, power, fame. What changed that? What changed that was that all of a sudden we have a mitzvah. So before I bite into that juicy 3/4 of an inch medium rare steak, I make a bracha. I bring home money that I work so hard for and I'm giving tzedakah. I have a beautiful house, my dream house. There's a mezuzah on the door. There's a shul going on. What is this doing? What this is doing is it's changing the fact. It's no more the heavens belong to God and spirituality and the earth belongs to the physical arrogance. Let's talk about what physical arrogance really means. Do you remember what Pharaoh tells Moses in this week's portion? God said, "Let my people go." What did Pharaoh answer? Who is God that I should listen to him? That is the definition of physical darkness. The ultimate physical darkness of rebellion, coarseness, arrogance. The form of thinking that I am separate from God. God is God and He's in heaven. I am here. That's what mitzvahs come to change. Mitzvahs come to change and transform the arrogance and the evil. So when is the best time to do that? Nay, when is the only time to do that in its fullest? It's only when the arrogance of the physical darkness is in its full course blossom. To transform physical in the times of King Solomon wasn't a real transformation. It's like the courtship. I don't understand. When I was dating him, he was such a mensch. He opened the door. What happened? Yeah, of course. When we're dating, I'm doing my work here. That's not the essence of the arrogance. That's not the essence of the physical. The essence of the physical is when I'm not affected or blinded by a love for spirituality. It is specifically when the Jewish people did their mitzvahs under the persecution and oppression and tyranny of the arrogance of pharaohs throughout history. Starting with the pharaoh within me that really thinks everything exists to fulfill my pleasures, my growth, in that full blossom of ugliness to do a mitzvah. That's the transformation. And now we need to understand what is the offspring of that type of mitzvah. If this is the power of the mitzvah, what's the offspring? I understand what the offspring is of the mitzvah when we do it in times of the Beis HaMikdash. The very definition of a mitzvah, when we ask what does the word mitzvah mean, commandment, we're taught tzafsa v'chibur, connection. Thus, when the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot says the reward of a mitzvah is mitzvah, Kabbalistically speaking, it means the reward of a mitzvah is that amazing connection you have with God. That is the reward of the mitzvah. The essence connection. But what greatness is there in doing mitzvahs under persecution? And the answer is, there's a verse that says, Kishalet Adam ba'Adam. And it means that when evil and darkness is oppressing goodness, and then we go ahead and under that oppression, in the dark times of Russia, in the dark times of hiding in Spain and having a seder underground, worried that if they're going to catch you, you're going to be the next korban on the auto da fe. When you do a mitzvah there, under that oppression, you are transforming the darkest ugliness of physical. A lot of questions, what do we gain from that? What's the offspring? For this, we're going to have to turn to a verse that King Solomon in his book of Kohelet, Ecclesiastics, right, in English. He says over there, I see that there's an advantage to wisdom over foolishness, as there is an advantage to light over darkness. Simply speaking, what he's saying is, there is light, there is darkness, and I see an advantage to light over darkness. However, Kabbalah zooms into his verse. The wording here isn't ki yisrin ha'oir al ha'choshech. It's saying ki yisrin ha'oir min ha'choshech. It doesn't say that there's an advantage to light over darkness. There's an advantage to light from darkness. And thus Kabbalah zooms in and says, and this was the verse I was looking for before in my English over here. Let's see if I can find it right now. Here it is. He made darkness his hiding place, about him as his booth. God is everything and everything is God. And thus, even evil is God, even darkness is God. Because there's nothing outside of God. This whole notion that there's a big war between God and the Satan. Who's the Satan, if not a piece of God? I just want to throw this out there. I remember when I was a kid, the people used to love asking the religious Jews, we're going to stump you. Are you going to stump me? I'm going to ask you a question. God can do everything? Yes, God is omnipotent. Can God create a rock that he can't lift? If he can create the rock, but he can't lift it, he can't do everything. If he can't create the rock, then he can't do everything. Well, another question. Can God create another God? What you do when you study Hasidus is you don't answer the question, you dissect the question. And the question doesn't make sense. If God is everything and everything is God, that means this rock is going to be a piece of God. So ask me your question again. Can God make a piece of God that he can't lift? And if God created another God, what would be the matter? What would be the material of that other God? God. So the other God is God. So there is no other. When you focus on this, you understand, and this is not easy to say, but you understand that Hitler was a piece of God just like Moses was. Because nothing exists but God. Thus you have to ask yourself, where does evil and darkness come from? If God is everything and everything is God, and I've come across in history and in life some really nasty pieces of God. Thus we need to understand that in the core, the essence of God is not light, it's darkness. Why? Over here I don't mean darkness as an evil. I'm not talking about, the Darth Vader versus the Jedi. We're talking about a different definition of darkness. Light, by definition, is revelation and expression. If it's revelation and expression, it has to be finite. Thus the infinite light, as much as you say it's infinite, by the mere fact that it's light, you're telling me it's not essence. For the same reason that we say God created something out of nothing. What is that supposed to mean? If God is everything and everything is God, then He's from what they created everything. So how can you tell me God created something out of nothing? It's not something out of nothing. If anything, it's a nothing out of something. Who is something if not God? And the answer is, I say that God created something out of nothing because God defies any parameters that I can call a something. Thus we say God, in the essence of God, King David tells us, it's not light, it's darkness. Now let's understand, where does this darkness manifest itself in God's universe? Not in the spiritual. Because the spiritual is not infinite. Thus it can only manifest itself in the physical. Because the physical, like the essence, defies any expression. Because spiritually speaking, physical is the ultimate nothingness. Because only spiritual describes what a something is. I want to put this in parentheses because I'm watching the eyes here looking at me like, huh? No, I haven't been smoking. So what are we talking about? You know that in Chassidus it says something very interesting. A teacher and a student, their relationship is finite. Because the teacher eventually has to tell the student, a cup kann man nicht darauf stellen. You come to me with a head, I'll be able to teach it. But I can't give you a head. You either have a brain and I can help you form it, or you don't have a brain. In a father-child, it's not like that. Who gave the child his brain? The father. So you would think that the Mishnah in chapter 6 says that there's 48 prerequisites before you can have a teacher-student relationship. You would think that before you make a baby, the answer is you can get drunk and have a baby. Why? Because to have a baby doesn't transfer through spirituality. It's a spiritual sperm, a physical sperm. So the question is, are you kidding me? A teacher-student relationship, which is lower, is, kadosh, kadosh, kadosh. To make a child, it's a physical sperm that can be done by accident? So Chassidus explains that because you're transmitting essence cannot be transmitted through spiritual refinement. Essence, which by definition cannot express itself in light and revelation, therefore the only way to express itself is in the physical darkness. And thus it could be done in a state of drunkenness and by mistake. What I'm trying to share with you here is that mitzvahs, the physical comes from the essence of God. Thus, let's go back to what King Solomon says. There's light and there's darkness. Whoa, what do you mean there's darkness? God is everything and everything is God. Yes, there's a part of God, so to speak, which is called darkness. What part of God is called darkness? We're talking about the essence of God, which defies expression and revelation. 1 second. So if darkness is the ultimate essence, the greatness, how come down here darkness means terrible? That's the way it came down until you perform the refinement. That's the job of a mitzvah. Once you perform the transformation of darkness, once I take the physical and use it for spirituality to serve God, what am I revealing? Ki yisrna oid min hachoshech. It's not light is greater than darkness. What he's really saying is that the greatest light is the darkness when it's transformed. That only a mitzvah can do. When can a mitzvah do that? When it's engaging with the darkness. Thus, this can only happen in the 2,000 years where we perform Torah and mitzvahs under the ultimate oppression and persecution of darkness. That's where the transformation comes. And then what are you revealing? You're revealing the ultimate light, which is the light, which is the essence, darkness, when it's revealed. When will that happen? When Mashiach comes. How do you know that will happen when Mashiach comes? There's a weird verse. It says that my flesh will see God. My flesh will see God. My mind will see God. How does your flesh, how does my fingers see God? The transformation of the darkness will reveal essence. Essence lies in the physical. You want to meditate about prayer? That's not going to do it. Move your lips. You want to meditate about how, oh, I wish I can help the poor? That's not going to help. Take out a quarter and give it to the man. The physical essence, that transformation, is the ultimate revelation of light. Which light? The light that King Solomon was talking about. The light that comes from the transformation of darkness. It's time to wrap this up a little bit. But there's one more point I want to talk about. So now we're sharing that there's two types of mitzvahs that we do. And this is the Boyim Yashris Yaakov, those who came and rooted in Jacob. What are the two types of mitzvahs we're talking about? The mitzvahs we performed under the greatness and the absolute revelation of the holy temples, which brought about an absolute humility to myself and all the Jews who were there. And what happens then? That brings about an offspring. What's the offspring? The revelation of the essence of the soul. Because that's what a mitzvah is all about. The mitzvah is about connection. The revelation of the essence of my soul connecting with the essence of God. And that will be revealed when Mashiach comes because we've done mitzvahs. Now let's talk about the second category. The second category is doing mitzvahs in the times of persecution. What is that all about? The transformation of evil. What happens when you transform evil? What you really reveal is that there is no such thing of evil. Because God is everything and everything is God. So that which you call good is the revelation of the infinite light of God. That which you call dark is really the essence of God, which is hidden. When you do a mitzvah, you reveal that. The transformation of the evil really reveals not the infinite light of God, but the essence of God. And what does that bring about? When Mashiach comes, you'll then have the ultimate revelation, which is not the revelation of God's light, but the revelation of God's essence. No. Fine. However, there's a very specific teaching that says that all the revelations of Messianic era is the outcome of what we're doing today in exile. Now, if that be the case, that means that not only is there a transformation of evil going to take place, the verse says, and God will eradicate all evil. He'll wipe tears off everyone's face. Okay, that I understand why it's happening. But when we talk about the ultimate revelation of the essence core of the neshama, the revelation of God, the essence, what do we say? We say that really is connected to when we served God with absolute humility and transparency. Where did that happen? When I stood in the holy temple and all of a sudden I'm seeing that there's something before my eyes I can't wrap my head around. God, face to face with God. But now we're saying that no. The teaching here is that everything that's going to happen when Mashiach comes is not happening because of what they did 2,000 plus years ago in the times of the temple, but because of what you and I are doing here under difficult times. Financial stress, health stress, and all the suffering. No, how does that make sense? So we must say that even now, we can't just be engaging with darkness. Somehow, even today, when we do mitzvot, we have to connect with the light. How does that happen? Thus, we're going to talk about the peaceful warrior. It happens through two ways. Number one, there's something very powerful that we have to pay attention to. When we were in the good days, all we had for Torah was what? 24 books. The entire oral law that we know as the masterpieces of Judaism, i.e., the Talmud, the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Brisa, the Tosefta. Where did all of that happen? Under the persecution. I mean, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who's a major member of this whole process of revelation, he was hiding in a cave. Rabbi Akiva was burnt with a Sefer Torah wrapped around him. I mean, we know the stories. That means the revelation of deep, unrevealed Torah facts didn't happen in the good days of King Solomon. It happened under the persecution. Why? Now you know why. Because God was balancing it out, giving us a light. Thus, if you want to know how to be a peaceful warrior in the times where a warrior is needed, don't always go to fight. Don't always, okay, I'm now going to break down the klipa and the evil. I'm rolling up my sleeves. No. You also need to be able to live in the peace and light of Torah. The Torah is peace. The Torah is light. This unprecedented revelation of Torah specifically in the dark times of exile so that I can be a peaceful warrior and not just a warrior of war. That's one thing. Another thing I want to share with you. Think good and it will be good. What does that mean? What it means is that a prince in prison is still a prince. Not only does it mean that a prince in prison is still a prince, it also means that while in prison, he can choose whether he's going to be in prison or not. Why so? The Holy Baal Shem Tov said, where your mind is, that's where you are. I told you that the previous Rebbe's teacher once saw a student looking out of the window, and he told him, better be outside looking in than being inside looking out. Because if you're inside looking out, you're out, and if you're outside looking in, you're in. Thus we understand that a prince in prison, he chooses, consciously or subconsciously, he chooses where he wants to be. He can choose to be here, or he can choose not to be here. He can choose to be in prison, or he can choose to be not in prison. Read the story of Joseph and you'll see what it means. That a prince in prison is still a prince who ultimately is not in prison. Thus you have people in Wall Street walking around with freedom who are in prison, and you have people in prison that are far from being in prison. They found life, they found God, they found family, they found meaning, they found purpose. Thus you should know that even while you're in exile, you have to be a peaceful warrior. How can you be a peaceful warrior? Number one, live in the peace and light of Torah. Study Torah. You don't have to all day worry about everything. Study Torah and forget about everything. Just for a little bit. Live in the light. Live in the peace. Number two, think good and it will be good. This is the definition of a peaceful warrior. Now, what is the difference between the two forms? Very simple. Am I living in the darkness? I'm fighting the darkness, but where am I? I'm all day in the darkness. That's all I'm thinking about is darkness, darkness, darkness. Where is he? I want to knock him out. But the bottom line, you're living in darkness. Or you're living in light. Thus we're telling you at some point, give up the fight and live in the light. Stop all day focusing on how much immorality and how many. Some people, I talk to them, it's unbelievable. Every single day the entire world is coming to chaos and then God has had it with us. Stop. We all listen to the news. We all open up the newspaper. We don't need to know how much chaos and immorality there is. But can you choose to think good? Can I, for a couple of minutes, live in the Bet HaMikdash while I'm here in North Miami, worrying about how I'm going to pay my rent? It's already the beginning of January. Can I do that? Yes, you can. And that's the message here. The message is, of course, you have to transform evil. But stop. Give yourself some time where you're not transforming evil. You're living in light. In closing, you know the worst mistake that any parent can make with a child who's going through teenage testosterone confusion or estrogen, whatever it is. This isn't gender oriented. Do you know the worst mistake that a teacher can make when they're dealing with a rebellious student? Do you know the worst mistake that a person can make with a difficult ex-spouse? Do you know the worst mistake anyone can make when they're dealing with anyone who's going through emotional altered stages? One thing, to get into their sandbox. Don't get into the kid's sandbox, because that's his domain of chaos. He's got the upper hand. You know, I have a friend in Los Angeles from my high school days still, and he shared something very powerful. He was going through a very, very, very bitter and scary moment with his wife. And his wife turned to him and said, listen to me. Don't bring me down to your level. Rise up to my level. We're having issues here. We got to work them out. But please don't bring me down to your predator shtick. Conquer or be conquered. That's not where I'm coming from. So this wasn't said as, I'm going to make you feel like you're lower and I'm higher. It was said with sincerity and love. And immediately that changed the entire reality for the man. They still had issues to go through, but it was on a different plane. That's the message of here. If you want to be a peaceful warrior, don't always go down. Don't always get into the sandbox and show evil that I'm going to show you once and for all. No. Every once in a while, bring it the other way around. Let's live in light. Let's bring it up to light. Yes, we spoke about addiction. It's a war. Can you stop with the war? Can you not be fighting the battle every moment? Can you be focusing on recovery? Can you be focusing on getting out of the spiritual malady? How do you do that? There's a step 10, 11, and 12. There's meditation. There's prayer. Stop always fighting. Stop fighting. There are people that all day long, they walk into the room and you don't even know them and you have a headache. I'm honestly, I've experienced this. There's some people, they walk into the room and I get a headache and I don't even know the person. But the energy, the chaos, the fighting, to kill or to be killed. Give it up, man. Surrender. Drop the fight. Not everything in life is a fight. Earning a living doesn't have to be a fight. A relationship doesn't have to be a fight. A health scare, going through procedures, doesn't have to be a fight. You don't have to always hold God's hand kicking and screaming. Sometimes we can just find peace. Sometimes we can disconnect with the darkness and connect with the light. Connect with the peace. And work from that point of view. People, thank you.